Welcome to the Debate at Go8 podcast series. Football season's in full swing, and there's one issue dominating the deliberations of boardrooms running football codes across the nation: CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Today we're discussing this issue with Associate Professor Michael Buckland, the founder and director of the Australian Sports Brain Bank, located within the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre. He's Australia's preeminent expert on CTE, a progressive brain disease associated with repeated traumatic brain injuries or blows to the head. It was first found in boxers more than 100 years ago and was originally called punch-drunk syndrome. Hello, my name's Ron Candelars. I'm a freelance journalist and producer, and throughout this series we've been canvassing a range of topics touching upon the work of all the Group of 8 universities. They include the Australian National University, Monash University, UNSW Sydney, the Universities of Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland and Western Australia. With me in the studio is Vicky Thompson, the CEO of the Group of 8 universities. Well, firstly, Associate Professor Michael Buckland, recognition of CTE in Australian sport is relatively new, but in more recent times it's been dominating headlines. What is CTE and how is it different from concussion?
Well, CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Either term is okay. And it's a name given to a disease which we've known about for almost 100 years. And certainly when I went through medical school a long time ago, we were certainly taught about dementia pugilistica or punch-drunk syndrome in boxers. And really, up until recently, I guess probably 10 years ago, I had carried with me throughout my medical career that concept that this was an oddity, a rarity that is not really seen anymore these days, only affecting boxers. And I think, as you've said, I think many people, it hasn't been on their radar. Currently, CTE is a pathological diagnosis. So it's defined by how it looks like down the microscope, not by the signs or symptoms that the person is displaying at the time. It's got quite a technical definition. So it's the accumulation of hyperphosphorylated tau in nerve cells and their processes.
So you can see this quite clearly with MRIs?
No, you can't see it. You need to actually look under the microscope.
You have to look at the brain itself.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
So currently we can only diagnose it after death. There's many groups working very hard to try and refine clinical diagnostic criteria so we can start to have a good go at diagnosing it during life. Mm-hmm. And there is work being done on new ligands for PET scans, and hopefully they will yield some benefit, because really once you're able to diagnose it during life, then you can start trialling treatments. But up until then, there's no point trying a treatment when you don't know if that person has or hasn't got the disease.
So unlike concussion, where there are some physical manifestations of that sometimes, there are none with this, and you may not even know until it's too late.
Yeah, so concussion and CTE, it's often conflated in the media, and they are definitely two different issues. Yeah. Concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury, and it's very serious in and of itself and requires appropriate treatment. CTE is a progressive neurodegenerative disease, not dissimilar to Alzheimer's disease. And the evidence to date indicates that it's not the number of concussions you've had that determines your risk for CTE. It's actually the number of years of contact sports played. And it's thought that that is a proxy to exposure to lots of head impacts. Some of them might be concussions, but the vast majority of them cause no signs or symptoms. So they're often called subconcussive or non-concussive impacts. A good whack in a footy game, which you feel okay, you get up, keep running. It's probably many hundreds, if not thousands of these that you're exposed to during life that set your brain up for a later in life degenerative disease.
And do we know why that happens? So many of these whacks, as you call it, over a period of time leads to this disease? Do we know exactly what's going on in the brain there?
We don't. We have some good ideas, but there's still a lot more work to be done. It's likely that these impacts very subtly injure the small blood vessels in the brain, as well as potentially doing sort of micro damage to the white matter, which is the wiring of the brain, so that the nerve cells have to send out their processes to communicate to other parts of the brain, and that's all bundled together in the white matter. And it's likely that there's subtle white matter damage going on as well.
So does that mean that, sorry Ron, so does that mean that if people, say, are being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, they could actually have CTE, but you don't know that until they pass away?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
So we've had probably a dozen cases that have come to us. They've got Alzheimer's disease written on their death certificate, but when you look at the brain under the microscope, it's CTE.
So this makes your job so much harder, though, doesn't it? That you have to physically have the brain there to examine rather than, scans and things like that. Tell us about how that limits your approach to the work that you want to do.
Well, it is limiting, but it's also remarkably enabling in other ways. Often the criticism that comes back around the idea of CTE and its causation by exposure to these repeated head impacts, people say, well, they're not, the numbers aren't big enough, or they want to see be very strict with the statistical interpretation, and because you're doing autopsy work, you're never going to get those huge population numbers to be able to get great p-values, etc., etc. So it is limiting in that way, in that you get a lot of detailed information, but not on lots and lots and lots of people.
Yeah.
On the flip side, diagnosing it by examining the brain tissue gives you a window into the actual organic processes that are going on. And so the brains that are donated to the brain bank not only have a diagnosis made, but then is able to power all this research into why does the tau accumulate, how does it spread, what else is going on.
And you use that term, what is that?
Tau. So tau is it's a normal protein in the brain, but in CTE it takes on an abnormal shape and with some abnormal modifications such as phosphorylation, and it aggregates together, and it continues to aggregate till it becomes sort of insoluble, and it builds up in the nerve cell, causes nerve cell dysfunction and eventually death.
Right.
And we do know that tau will spread. It's quite a remarkable insight in that abnormal tau, if it comes across normal tau in the brain, it'll actually catalyse it and convert it into that abnormal form, and that's how it spreads.
Right.
It's not dissimilar to, I often use the analogy of zombies. So we know zombies aren't real people, and the way that they propagate is by coming across a normal person and biting them, and then that person becomes a zombie. Right. And that's how you get a zombie apocalypse. And it's almost the same with tau. As it builds up, it's almost an exponential reaction.
Right.
But that's not unique to CTE. Tau accumulates in other neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and some of the frontotemporal dementias. We know that if you look at it under an electron microscope, the actual conformation of that protein, the way it's folded, is different in CTE compared to Alzheimer's disease or compared to the frontotemporal dementias.
How did you get into this business? What drove you to be so specialised in this particular area?
Naivety.
Or curiosity. Maybe curiosity.
So my job, I work as a neuropathologist. So my whole job, clinical job, is around the diagnosis and classification of brain disease.
But what fascinated you about the brain? Because there's a lot of bits to us. Obviously, the brain is what really got you going.
Yes. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this since we're at Sydney University, but I went to medical school here and I hated it until we did the neuro topic, and then I just really sparked something in me, and ever since then I've known I was going to do something brain related. And I think it's because the brain contains everything that we are. It's our personalities, our memories, our relationships, and it's all just in this sort of blob of squishy tissue we carry around in our heads. It's just remarkable.
It's amazing, isn't it?
So how did the Australian Sports Brain Bank at University of Sydney first come into being then?
So I certainly see a lot of I had been seeing a lot of brains, not only from coronial work but hospital autopsies, and I was seeing a lot of neurodegenerative disease. But I was following the literature from the US, where Anne McKee from Boston University published the beautiful illustrations of CTE, and for about a year I was thinking, how come I've never seen that? I see all this other stuff, but I never see that. And it took me a little while to realise that I probably wasn't looking in the right population, and I probably wasn't looking at the brain in the right way. So I decided that I needed to start looking at brains from ex-sports people. I could not convince coroners that this was a potential public health issue.
Why not? What was their pushback?
Well, there were no cases in Australia. No cases had been reported.
That they knew of, yeah.
Yes, and certainly there were quite prominent sporting doctors saying that it's an American NFL thing. It's not here.
So do you think that reticence was because they love their sport and thought that this was an attack on the integrity of these sports?
That's one of the reasons, and I think the other reason is that there's big money involved, and whenever big money's involved, the science often gets clouded. So it's almost two things. It's like big, big money, and also just people just love their footy. So I've got a lot of pushback over the years.
I bet. How prevalent is CTE though? Is it only for those who've had a long career in a collision sport, or can it manifest itself quite quickly? Can it affect young athletes pretty quickly?
It can definitely affect young athletes. The earliest we have in our bank is a 20-year-old. We'd have at least a dozen under the age of 40. And I know in the US, I think they've found it in a 17 or 18-year-old. So it can definitely affect people at all ages. We don't know how common it is. And it has been, to me, that over the last few years, there's been this sort of rising sense of alarm in that, actually, we haven't touched the bottom yet. We don't know how prevalent this issue is. And it seems that in the young people that get the disease, and we don't know why some people get the disease when they're young and some only when they're in their 60s or 70s. But if it does declare itself in a young person, often it's the signs and symptoms they display very much overlap with mental health issues or post-traumatic stress disorder. They try all these treatments and so forth and nothing seems to work, and obviously the ones that we get are the ones that have passed away, and more often than not that's through suicide. So I find it remarkable that, the Australian government puts in so much money, youth mental health, suicide prevention, but at the same time is funding these activities which actually accelerate those issues.
So you can see a direct link between mental health issues, potentially suicide in some cases, and CTE.
A direct link. There's a strong association.
Yes. And they may have been misdiagnosed because you can't diagnose it until after death.
That's correct.
So success for you and your research would be a situation where you potentially could diagnose it before people have actually died.
That's the holy grail. And we're actually working on that.
And are we anywhere near that?
Well, yes, we are, I think. So the process for the clinical diagnostics is the same process that people have used for to diagnose Alzheimer's disease, in that you put forward a proposed group of clinical criteria, and then you prospectively test them. So you go out and use those criteria against a whole lot of people. Some of them will pass away. You look at their brains and, did they have CTE or not? So those clinical diagnostic criteria, the initial round of those, they've just in 2021, they published the sort of the autopsy correlations, and they found that almost everyone that did have CTE were captured in those criteria, but they were very sensitive, but they weren't very specific in that of all the people that got that diagnosis of what they called TES, only about 20% of them had CTE. So it was casting too broad a net. So they've now revised the criteria, and they're currently working on testing those revised criteria. And then there's a lot of work, more basic laboratory work, including with our collaborators here at the University of Sydney, in trying to find like a small molecule marker, some marker that you can use either for a PET scan or a blood test. And I think we will get there. And I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, but by the time I retire, that we will be there, yeah.
But it is a massive story potentially, because when you think about it, I mean, Australians are a sporting nation. They laud physical toughness, aggression. These are all key aspects of Australian rules football, rugby, etc. And more we're seeing this link with collision and sport. So you can see why you would have had some reticence from people in the past saying that this is attacking the integrity of the game. So what does it mean for the bump in AFL football? What does it mean for the header in soccer? What does it mean for particular tackles in rugby league and rugby union? So it's not surprising that you've had some real pushback.
Yes. And probably the most hot button topic is, we have called on several occasions that there should be no contact sports for children under the age of 14.
Yeah.
Their brains are developing. There is good evidence that a child that goes to hospital with a concussion has a 40% increased risk of novel mental health disorders after a single concussion, with taking CTE out of the equation completely.
What's the reception been to those calls?
Yes, animated.
I'm sure.
But
it's a hard one though, isn't it? Because we are a great sporting nation.
Yes.
Our kids, we want our kids to play sport.
Governments fund these sports, as you mentioned before, with millions of dollars. And one of the questions I was going to ask, does it come to a point where if the codes themselves can't regulate these things, does then government have to be strong enough to say, look, we're taking this out of your hands, we don't believe that you'll make those tough calls because of the passion for the game, etc., and the integrity of the game. Maybe governments have to then step in. If you want the funding, then this is what has to happen with your sport.
Yes, I think so. I think that is the answer. I'm not aware of any...
That'll go down like a lead balloon.
I'm not aware of any great sort of industry self-regulation that's worked really well. So I think governments do need to step in, as you said, because there's millions of dollars not only in funding for the sports, but we as taxpayers are picking up the bill for the long-term consequences. So we're paying twice. And so I think we do need government to step in. Last year, near the end of 2023, there was the results of a Australian Senate inquiry into concussions and head impacts in contact sports. And there was some fantastic recommendations there, and we're actually waiting to see what the government's response will be. And we're yet to hear. I can't imagine politically, in an election cycle, you're probably not going to tackle that one head on.
But you've attracted some pretty big names, haven't you, who've pledged to support the brain bank, obviously when they're no longer with us. That must help in terms of the public, the outward-facing kind of perception.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's been quite a remarkable journey. When I started, I found that I was making a lot of calls. I would hear of someone passing away, and I would be on the phone. I'd be working the phones, trying to get to be able to speak to either the family or someone close to them. And over the years, I have had to make less phone calls, and now we're finding that families are raising it with the coroner, and so it's coming to us without us having to actually go out looking for it. And even we had one case 2 years ago where it was in a country town, and the policeman that took the body to the morgue, to the coroner's, just happened to say to the clerk, this guy was a local footy legend, do you think he might have CTE?
Wow.
Right.
And they contacted us, and he did have CTE.
Yes. Which brings us, then long term, you talk about the holy grail of being able to diagnose this without actually physically seeing, the brain there in the research that you do and using scans, etc. Which then brings us to the issue of brain banks more generally and how many we have and whether we have a national approach. We don't have a national approach to it yet, do we?
No, we don't have a national approach.
Which seems pretty odd.
I think, again, maybe CTE will be the sort of the poster child that gets this issue up on the front foot. We know now that dementia is the leading burden on our healthcare system. Our understanding of dementia and the causes and what's going on in the brain is sort of like our understanding of cancer back in 1985.
Right.
We have a long way to go to catch up. And
is that an Australian phenomenon, or is that
no,
international?
Yeah,
okay.
Thing is, you can cut most cancers out and then look at them. But with the brain, you a lot of it is really dependent on getting that tissue at death. And so I think brain banks are really quite fundamental towards advancing proper understanding of the disease process. So I learnt about breast cancer when I was at medical school, and there were 3 types. And now there's 20 plus types.
Right.
And that's the sort of progress we've made in cancer.
And are you finding that more athletes are prepared to donate brains, and more people in the community are now thinking about this and making that pledge to donate their brain for research?
Yes.
So all the more reason why we need brain banks across the country in every state.
Absolutely.
Because we don't have that currently, do we?
That's right. We used to have what was called the Australian Brain Bank Network, which was had representations in every state, but that funding was not renewed by the NHMRC. We've now made several approaches to MRFF to get MRFF funding. They've been unsuccessful to date, but I think it is actually a very important issue. And it's not only just the research, it's remarkable the therapeutic effect when a family that's gone through some dreadful process can actually get answers. So it has a clinical value as well as a research.
And then it falls back on organisations like MS Australia, for example. I'm a board director of MS Australia, and I think you're a co-director of the Brain Bank. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So it falls back on those sorts of organisations, and we had a long discussion with it at our board about 18 months ago, because we have to continue to support it and fund it. Is funding the issue, do you think? Why did the NHMRC pull out from brain banks?
I don't know. What I was
just seems a very short-sighted decision.
Yes. What I was told is that they don't like funding infrastructure. There's different funding mechanisms for infrastructure, but yet when we apply for those mechanisms, then...
So wouldn't it sit under, to get a bit in-house, but wouldn't it sit under NCRIS, like National Collaborative Research Infrastructure, for example?
Well, that's what we've been applying.
For
recently, yes.
So all the more reason to get these sorts of things up and running, because obviously from the work you're doing, you mentioned, we could have quantum leaps in our knowledge with the level of support. One question I want to ask you, though, is for athletes who play collision sports and for the family members involved with those athletes, what would you be saying to people to watch for in terms of symptoms for CTE?
Well, I think it is important. I still personally think it's not going to be a common disease,
Right.
And that there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that play contact sports, and so that the risk is probably low, and it's very important to give a balanced message. This is a problem, but it's not something that everyone needs to freak out about. What we know is that your risk of CTE correlates best with the number of years played. So you should think about delaying your children, their exposure to head impacts in contact sports for as long as you can. Mm-hmm. And we certainly recommend 14 years. The other thing is, if you're on the other side of the other end of your sort of playing career, you should think about how many years you've been playing and whether or not you should probably hang up the boots sooner rather than later.
Right.
That's the most important thing. And I think if people are worried, they need to see their GP. They need to find a good GP, and that's where you start the journey. We regularly get calls from concerned parents, and after speaking to them for 5 minutes, it becomes evident that their child has persistent post-concussion symptoms, not CTE. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's been pretty much neglected in our healthcare system as well. This management of concussion, I think it's being addressed now. And also these people that, for whatever reason, they have their symptoms go on for months and months and months. How do we deal with them? Because it can be very debilitating.
So to wrap up, in, say, 40 years' time, if you get the research funding you need and the resources you need, what would you be hoping to achieve, and what impact do you think some of your research might have on the way we play collision sports in future?
Well, CTE is the only neurodegenerative disease I know of that's almost completely preventable, and so I think we need to be smart. And I don't know if you remember this. I remember this when I was growing up, that I had to get on the bus and it was just full of smoke. It was just awful. Awful. I hated it. Can you imagine trying to get your kids onto a bus like that now? You'd probably be arrested. And changing the sort of the narrative around tobacco, it's almost you need a generational change for people to start to wake up to things. So I guess in 40 years' time we will have that generational change, and I would hope that people think about CTE and contact sports like the summer sun in the middle of the day. You know, you love the beach, but you know you've got to regulate your exposure, and everyone does it in different ways. And I would wish everyone in Australia had that mindset towards exposure to head impacts.
Well, Professor Buckland, hopefully you get the research funding you need long term, and it's a fascinating topic that really is, you can see, going to dominate news in the years ahead. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for your company today. If you'd like more information about the issues raised in this podcast or other related topics, please visit our website at go8.edu.au. And a quick reminder that you can always tune in to Debate at Go8 on Spotify, Google, Apple or YouTube. Bye for now.